Mr. Tucker, you recently authored an article in Houston Chronicle about the congressman's trip to Azerbaijan in May of 2013. How difficult was the research involved in finding out the details of this trip? What were your primary sources?
Primary sources on this story were mostly documents, and mostly publicly available documents at that. And we also had to confirm with the companies such as BP that had given money for this conference that occurred on May 27th, 2013 in Baku. The main documents we used to find the story were tax forms. So we had stumbled across some campaign finance contributions to Representative Steve Stockman from Texas, from the director of a nonprofit that was based in Houston called the Turquoise Council of Americans and Eurasians. And this is a group that basically does advocacy for the Turkic world in the United States. They host every year, for instance, or I'm not sure every year, but they host a Silk Road Festival in Houston, and things like that, cultural events. But they also sponsor trips for members of Congress overseas, and they've done that for several years, going back to, I think, 2011. Now, on a tax form for a nonprofit, for a 501c3, those groups have to disclose when and how much money they spend on travel for members of Congress or other public officials. And so we pulled the 990s, the tax forms from 2011 on through 2013, the last available one. 2012, the last available one. And we're able to see that that nonprofit had not disclosed any money spent on travel for members of Congress. And that was obviously a flag for us. That was something to look into further. So we kept looking into the Turquoise Council of Americans and Eurasians, found out that they were connected to several other Turkic nonprofits from around the country, and that all of these nonprofits had together sponsored travel for members of Congress to Baku in 2013. And the interesting thing about that was that the other documents that were available here were congressional travel forms. And when you file a congressional travel form as a member of Congress, what you're doing is asking for permission from the Ethics Committee to go on this trip if the travel is privately sponsored. And in the pre-travel filings from these members of Congress, we noticed that their itineraries included meeting with SOCAR officials in Azerbaijan. Their itineraries included this conference that was the main event of their trip in Baku. And we were able to pull photos of that event that were available on the website for the convention's website, and saw that there were all these corporate logos in the background, something that a reasonable person could have noticed as evidence of a sponsorship. But the problem there was that on the pre-travel congressional filings, there's no mention of any kind of corporate sponsorship for the convention that they attended. And by putting together those public documents, we were able to piece together the broad strokes of the story. Again, had to go get confirmation from the oil companies, particularly BP, that told us that they had spent $10,000 sponsoring the convention that the members of Congress attended. And from there, we had our story.
Mr. Tucker, what are the ethical guidelines governing the behavior, these trips made by the congressman? For the Azerbaijani audience specifically, could you please explain what is it that the U.S. congressman possibly did wrong or could have done?
Sure. The real issue here is whether any member of Congress went and saw all those logos and then didn't report it. Again, that's, from photos that we reviewed of the convention, it seemed as though anyone attending the conference could have reasonably suspected that corporate sponsors were taking part in the event. It said pretty clearly on some banners behind speakers at the events that BP had sponsored the convention, SOCAR had sponsored the convention. And the problem there is that we didn't see any, nowhere on the post-travel forms that were filed by the members of Congress did they say that they had seen evidence that another corporation besides the nonprofit that they knew about had sponsored the trip. And that's a problem because the rule states that no organization that hires lobbyists in Washington, D.C. can sponsor travel for members of Congress. And so the issue here is that BP obviously employs lobbyists, ConocoPhillips employs lobbyists, and SOCAR is a big lobbying presence on the Hill as well. So putting that together was, putting all those issues together presents the real issue for the members of Congress here.
It has been almost a week since the article was published. Has any congressman gotten back to you on this story? Have you been able to contact with other congressmen whose names are mentioned in this story?
We have, actually. Representative Ted Poe from Houston has responded to our questions. He's the only one, actually, the only member of Congress that's responded to our follow-up questions after the story was published. But a spokesman for Ted Poe said last week that he had raised the issue with the Ethics Committee and asked for a review of the forms that had been filed by the nonprofits to make sure there was nothing wrong with them. He said that he raised the allegations with the Ethics Committee, which is a big deal because we also have experts, ethics experts and advocates from across the political spectrum that we interviewed in the past week that said, that really called for an Ethics Committee investigation on this. We've got people from Judicial Watch, from Citizens for Ethics in Washington, several prominent ethics experts that we've talked to have all called for an Ethics Committee investigation, which I think is significant in the, when put together with the fact that Ted Poe has also, alerted the Ethics Committee to the issues we raised in our story.
Now, Mr. Tucker, this is your first research in Azerbaijan. Did you just stumble onto this subject? I mean, how did it happen? What piqued your interest about Azerbaijan and about this story?
Well, I'm particularly interested actually in an issue in Washington today that is, foreign lobbying, things that are reported on FARA filings. So the Foreign Agents Registration Act is a law that was passed in the 1930s to provide disclosure for lobbyists who are working on behalf of foreign governments in Washington, D.C. in the public interest, because the public has a right to know who is lobbying their members of Congress. And so I had been interested in that issue, also interested in the overarching issue of trips for members of Congress and how that plays into FARA disclosure. But also Lisa Olson and I in Houston had been researching Steve Stockman from Texas in the fall, and again found campaign finance or campaign contributions to his campaign from the director of this nonprofit, and that really started the ball rolling on this issue.
Mr. Tucker, do you plan to continue research? What are your plans with regard to this project that you have began, either with regard to Azerbaijani lobbying or Steve Stockman or the congressman's trips abroad generally?
Right. I think our next step is to continue talking to ethics experts, these people who are calling for an ethics committee investigation, and the next step would obviously be to cover anything that comes of this. So it'll take a few months for the Office of Congressional Ethics to complete their review and then decide to either refer this to the ethics committee or drop the issue. If they go that far, there's not an OCE investigation yet, but there might be one in the future. So the next step is to cover this issue as it goes down the line in that progression. I also think that I will focus more on FARA disclosure in the coming months because FARA operates really, the disclosure comes out 6 months or so after the event. So when you, as a lobbyist for a foreign government, file a supplemental statement under the Foreign Agents Registration Act, you have to disclose every meeting that you had with members of Congress. You have to disclose every call that you made to American media. It's very extensive. It's a lot of source material to work on. A lot of ideas can come from that. So I think what I'm going to do in the future over the next few months is watch particularly the Azerbaijani Foreign Agent Registration Act filings. Just make sure, over the past few months while we were reporting the story, while other issues have come before Congress, that are of interest to Azerbaijan, I'm going to watch that pretty closely. So that's my plan.